Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Here we are. Now we are into heart. So I'm excited. I'm kind of clapping a little bit because we move out of all that cellular stuff and into actual organ systems, which you guys already have brought a little bit of background knowledge to this course, and you can build on that and make it stronger and more efficacious for your patients. So the circulatory system, there's right, there's left. I think that is a great place to start. And we're going to go through every one of these steps. Blood is returned to the right heart. It's pumped from the right heart to the lungs. From the lungs, it goes back to the left heart. From the left heart, it goes to the body. That's a great starting place. And here is a visual. I have tons of visuals here. So you can see and it's anatomical right, don't forget. So right side of the heart, left side of the heart. And as a side note, the heart is generally a left-sided structure. That's why we take our right hand, put it over our heart when we're standing for the national anthem. And blood is returned from the body after we've used up oxygen. We also have the blood go through the liver and pick up nutrients. It's kind of a cool little process there. So that nutrient-rich blood, but it is deoxygenated blood, is returned to the right heart. It is pumped out to the lungs to get oxygen. It is sent back to the right side of the heart. Oh, what a mess I'm making. And out to the aorta, to the body. In the body, we distribute nutrients and oxygen through capillary beds. We then send that oxygen and depleted blood back to the liver, get nutrients back to the right heart. We do it all over again. Got it? We're done. I'm out. Just kidding. That's the overall gist. We're going to kind of go through it step by step. So I just wanted to give you that generalized gist. Don't forget that this is a closed circuit. So pressure is very important. If blood pressure gets too low for a multitude of reasons, you don't have perfusion. If you don't have perfusion, you can't get the nutrients and the oxygen across these little capillary beds. And the capillary beds are where that transition happens. So these all represent small capillaries. And that's where O2 and nutrients can cross over. We looked at that quite a bit too with inflammation. And so we'll push those things out to the tissues for the body to use. So let's get more into it. Here's a circulatory system broken down into right and left. I think that is helpful. The other thing that I like to do with my students is to draw the heart as a grid. And this would be the right atrium. Left atrium. This is so much harder to do than I thought. Right ventricle. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, right ventricle, left ventricle. Sorry, a little brain fart there. All right, left ventricle. And then I take and I just can't spell things out. So I'm going to slowly tell you what they are. Superior vena cava enters into the right atrium, bringing used up blood from the upper extremities in the head and neck. And then the right ventricle, the inferior vena cava, comes into the right atrium as well. Let me erase that. Sorry. There we go. Inferior vena cava comes into the right atrium as well, bringing used up blood from the lower extremities in the liver. They pass through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. They leave by the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the pulmonary arteries and go out to the lungs. At that point, refreshed blood from the lungs returns to the left atrium by the pulmonary veins, goes through the bicuspid or mitral valve. I believe cardiologists prefer mitral, into the left ventricle, leaves the left ventricle to the body by the aorta. If you're not familiar with that, back this up and review it. There's also two more valves. Pulmonary semilunar will be here. Aortic semilunar will be in here. And we're going to go through all these things as we go along. What I would suggest to you is to, in a much neater fashion, write this out on a piece of paper, and you can fill these things in as you go. Now, is this how the heart is structured? Absolutely not. What happens is the heart starts as one chamber, then two, then four, then twists. So it's very confusing. And even when I'm teaching this in my anatomy lab, I will still take the pointer and backtrack it through vessels to make sure that I am in the right chamber. There are some clues. Left ventricle is very thick, very big because it pumps to the body. Right ventricle is slightly smaller than the left ventricle because it only pumps to the lungs. Right and left atria, atrium is singular, atria is plural, will just pump from top to bottom of the heart. They're pretty small and thin. So my advice to you is make that chart and start to memorize where the blood flow goes, where the valves are, and it'll help you to remember moving forward. Heart lies diagonally. We spoke about that. It has layers. It has the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. Epicardium is an outer layer on the outside. We're going to get much into that. Myocardium we are going to talk about. That is cardiac muscle. And cardiac muscle is one of the three types of muscles that we will talk about moving forward. And it's made up of Y-shaped cells. And this one cardiac cell talks to two talks to four. Give me just a second. That's the nucleus. Cardiac cells only have one nucleus. This one cardiac cell talks to the next, etc. And then there's two here. And that makes the conduction across the heart muscle exponential, quick, fast, and efficient, because our heart beats so often. Okay, so myocardium is made up of these Y-shaped cells, and they have little what are called striations across them, which are the small fibers in the cell. And they connect by what are called the intercalated discs. These intercalated discs have junctions that allow ions to flow quickly from one cell to another. I always think of it like the spread of gossip. This one tells two, the next two tell four, etc. So it gets around the heart, that gossip, really quickly. And there's actually pictures of myocardial cells in a little bit. We'll review that. Endocardium is the inner lining. That is one thin layer of what are called squamous cells, which are egg-shaped cells. And that actually is continuous with blood vessels throughout the entire cardiovascular system. Surrounding the heart is what's called the pericardium or the pericardial sac. That is tight. Okay, if this is the heart, I mean, there's no way I could draw it on there. It is right on there. And there's just, that's not bad. There's just a thin layer of what's called serous fluid in between them. And that serous fluid, I'm sure you're well aware, allows the heart to beat without it rubbing together on that pericardium. It protects the heart, it surrounds the heart, but it can cause problems. It will not expand. That pericardial sac is much like a Glad bag, those thick, like black ones that you put your leaves in. It doesn't stretch. So if you get fluid in this space due to an infection, inflammation, some bad irritation, it won't push the pericardial sac out. It will push the heart in. And if it pushes the heart in, we can't get the appropriate amount of blood into the heart to get pumped out of the heart. And that causes a lot of problems. So that's an important concept for you to know. Here's the heart wall. Okay. There's the chambers we spoke about. There's the valves. Please make note of them. Maybe make your little chart. And you can see the chart does not correlate with the actual structure of the heart. The heart's really funky in how it's structured. The pulmonary trunk actually comes across and in front from that right ventricle and then shoots off to the lungs. And then the aorta passes behind it from the left ventricle. And then we know it arches and then goes down and creates the three parts of the aorta, which we'll get into in the future. Well, maybe I should talk about now. So you have the arch of the aorta, and you also have thoracic, and then below the diaphragm, I hope you all know this, you have abdominal aorta. It's important to know the difference because they can both cause or have an aneurysm. That could be a problem. Okay, so here's the layers. There's the endocardium. Here's a myocardium, which is basically the muscle. Okay, there's a pericardial cavity. And then there's different layers to the pericardial sac. I think for our purposes, knowing it's a pericardial sac is probably sufficient. You can break it down on this picture if you would like to. So the great vessels, we have superior and inferior vena cava. They go into the right atrium, bringing blood that needs to be reoxygenated. Right and left pulmonary arteries are where we have it leave from the pulmonary trunk that go out to the lungs. I'm going to go back to this picture. We have pulmonary veins and aorta. Something kind of tricky here. People tend to think that the arteries have oxygenated blood. No, arteries go away from the heart, away, AA. Veins bring blood back to the heart. So let's go back a picture here. In this case, let me get my little drawing thing here. Oh, there we go. Okay. In this case, off the right ventricle, where we have deoxygenated blood, we have the pulmonary trunk, which immediately divides to the pulmonary arteries because they are going away from the heart. The pulmonary veins come from the lungs back to the left atrium. Okay, so make note of that slight but important difference. And then we have the aorta. The aorta will be that main artery that goes out to the entire body, large. It's very important. If somebody has an aneurysm that bursts in the aorta, very bad news. Okay, so check that out. Atria, we have right and left, that's smaller. Ventricles, we have right and left, they are thicker. The left ventricle is the thickest. We could look at this picture here. We already spoke about this. I also orient myself to the heart, not only with the left ventricle, but with the pulmonary trunk. I always put that in the front. I know I'm looking at the front of the heart and I could find things from there. We have what are called AV valves because they are between the atria and the ventricles. We have the tricuspid on the right part of the heart between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and mitral is on the left heart between the left atrium and the left ventricle. They actually have little strings on them called chordae tendineae, and that's where we get the term heartstrings. Semilunar valves are in that pulmonary trunk in the aorta. They look like little half moons. If you were to actually dissect it out, they look like the cusps of half moons, but they both cause an effective way to prevent backflow of blood into areas that it shouldn't be. And here's a picture. You can see the right and the left AV and the right and the left. Oh, I'm sorry. They're showing you different. Okay. They are showing it to you. Oh, they do have them. I apologize. Okay, what they are showing you here is that the atrioventricular valves, when they are open, the pulmonary and the aortic, which are here, will be closed because we're filling up the ventricles from the atria. The blood is flowing at that point. I'm going to actually show you pictures and maybe a video of the blood flowing from the atria down to the ventricles. And we've got to keep them in the ventricles. Ergo, the aortic and the pulmonary semilunar valves need to be closed because pulmonary goes to the lungs, aortic goes to the body. We're not ready yet. We're just transferring blood from the atria to the ventricles. When it's time to pump the blood out of the heart, the tricuspid, and I'm not sure if you could see my pointer or not, the tricuspid and the mitral will close so we don't get backflow into the atria, and we will push the blood out to the body through the aorta and out to the lungs through the pulmonary trunk. All right, so blood in a healthy heart should flow one way. When the ventricles are relaxed, we're undergoing what's called diastole, and we should be familiar with that. I always think of it as dying off. And at that point, the atria are pushing the blood, or whatever little blood that is left in them, down into the ventricles in preparation for the heart to contract. In systole, the ventricles contract and blood is pushed out to the lungs and the heart through those semilunar valves. I believe I pulled up a bunch of stuff. Bear with me. I don't think we really need to review that. No, I think I closed it because I figured what I would show you would be good. Yes. Okay, so back to the notes. So, blood flow. And if you can imagine, almost like my hand squeezing gently in both the atria, pushing the rest of the blood from the atria down, it'll fill up the ventricles, and then I move both my hands down to the left and right ventricle, and I squeeze those and I push the blood out. That's basically the flow of blood going through the heart. And with that cardiac cycle, during diastole, blood will fill into the right atrium and the left atrium, trickle down into the right and left ventricle, and during systole, the right and left ventricle will be contracting and push the blood out to the lungs and to the body. Here's a breakdown, and they also talk about the valve sounds, that lub-dub. So lub-dub correlates to the closing of the AV valves and then the semilunar valves, lub-dub, okay, as the blood flows through the heart. I believe they have that in there. If you look at it a little bit quicker, you can see the beginning of the contraction of the atria. They squeeze the rest of the blood down through the AV valves, the beginning of ventricle contraction. Now the AV valves have closed. We will push through those semilunar valves, and then as the ventricles relax, those semilunar valves close, and then there's a brief period of rest. Now, in addition to supplying blood to the entire body, we need blood in the heart. Kind of a crazy sort of thought, but it is a very important thought. So there is a very specific circulation called the coronary circulation. And this supplies oxygen and nutrients to the heart structures and also carries wastes away. So the primary blood supply come from what are called the right and the left coronary artery, which come right off the aorta. The right goes to the right side of the heart, the left goes to the left. And don't forget, we're talking about anatomical right and left. Now, let me see the pictures here. I had a little bit of problem with these pictures. I'm blowing them up. Oh, there we go. Okay. So right here you can see, here's the aorta. Coming right off the aorta, and the pulmonary trunk, kind of this lighter depiction here is just the crossover of the pulmonary trunk. So coming off the left side, we have left coronary artery. Coming off the right, we have right. Now, right coronary artery, you can look, there's a lot of different depictions of these arteries. For the most part, this right coronary artery will come down, and this is representing the back of the heart. And it kind of hits that back side of the ventricles. You can also have what's called a marginal artery there. And then there is, all right, well, I'll get into that in just a minute. Okay, and the left side, we have the left, and that will come down and serve the front of the left ventricle. And you've, I'm sure, heard this, anterior interventricular, also known as left anterior descending. And then there's a marginal artery, which will go to just part of that heart muscle there. Now, in addition to that blood supply, I know that there was one or two more. Okay, we talked about right marginal branch, posterior descending branch, left anterior descending branch, and circumflex conus. I've rarely heard this referenced, but I do want to point it out to you because it is in the notes. The conus is actually this small branch right in this region, just to point that out. Now, there is also venous drainage for the heart. Okay, and if we look at this, this represents the back of the heart. No, this is actually, this is still the front side of the heart. They have the coronary sinus back is represented as this lighter blue here, and it actually wraps around the back of the heart. I have a different picture I would like to show you. And the coronary sinus is where all of the veins from the heart muscle collect and drain into, and brilliantly enough, it goes right into the right atrium. And I'll show you where that goes in just a second. Okay, so that's coronary sinus. So there's a left anterior descending, just like the artery, and then that will go back to the great cardiac vein, which wraps around to that coronary sinus. And you can see there's a smaller cardiac vein as well. Let's look at the ones that are listed. Make sure I got them all. Yep, got all of those. As far as the veins, we got coronary sinus, great cardiac vein, posterior vein of the left ventricle is one of the last ones. And I'm sorry I'm going back and forth, but there's a ton of these. If you bring up different pictures, you'll see different names, different presentations. I want to make sure I'm hitting all the ones that your class is presenting to you. So the last one that we need, posterior vein of the left ventricle, would be behind this left ventricle, and it's not even in the picture. Let me see if I can find it for you. Okay, branches of the right coronary artery, quick review. Here is the right coronary artery with that conus artery coming off of it. Left coronary artery. And then we have here, I brought up this picture because I believe this has left anterior descending. So you could see that one represented there. As far as, I don't think that I got, there's left anterior descending again. See, there's a ton of different names. So it gets kind of confusing. I don't think that I got the coronary sinus here. All right, so, here's a picture of the back of the heart. You can pause it and take a closer look. I think it really helps on this picture to see the coronary sinus there. And you could see all the other names, but we'll limit it down to what is presented in the class. And there's that posterior vein of the left ventricle. That's the one I was looking for. All right. Okay. So that gets us through the coronary circulation. And to our first question, Okay, read every single word carefully, which would be correct. Very confusing. Don't forget, you can always jot things down. You could do that chart if that helps you. What do you think that is? And a lot of this is just memorizing. Once again, take a minute, read this, make sure you understand it, and then move on. Okay, so conduction system of the heart. There are, I'm sure what you are used to hearing, SA node and AV node. So these are circuits through the heart of hyperexcitable cells, which facilitate the constriction of the atria and the constriction of the ventricles in a rhythmic and correct pattern. So you can actually get, as you guys know, a pacemaker that's not the appropriate pacemaker. You get hyperexcitable cells if you have someone who has had some sort of heart issue, and that sets the pace, and it won't set the appropriate pace. The SA node is our good old pacemaker at 60 to 100 beats per minute. It starts to signal and allows it to travel down through the atria, down through the ventricles, and allows the blood to get through appropriately and out where it needs to go. The other issue, if you don't have the proper conduction system of the heart, is not getting enough blood in and not getting enough blood out. If you don't get enough blood in, the heart will start to flutter, as you know, and try to get more blood going. Blood pressure goes up, bad things happen. If you don't get enough blood out, it'll start to circle in there and it can cause a clot. So we got to have a good conduction system. So let me show you a picture, and then you could go back and reference these names and take notes if you need to. This is a great picture. This is very similar to the one I used for my A&P course. So here's the right atrium. This is where the sinoatrial node is. And once again, hyperexcitable cells that when we start to contract the heart sends a signal down across both atria, so they start to contract, stimulate the AV node or atrioventricular node. Makes sense. It's between the atria and the ventricles. It then goes through this little part, which is one line known as the bundle of His. I know some places are calling it something different at this point. Probably most of you know it as bundle of His. And then we get down to right and left bundle branches. That probably sounds familiar because we can get blocks in there, okay? Anatomical right, anatomical left. And then as it comes back up, and we're still talking about an electrical signal, it's going down through this pattern in this order. It allows the ventricles to contract, and it sends blood out to the lungs and to the heart. Whew. Now, on this picture, there's LABB that's not in the notes, though, so I don't think you're going to have to know that. I would know the ones that are listed here. And that is how the electrical current flows through the heart. So those are the main areas that initiate and perpetuate the signal. And then it sends it across the myocardial cells, those little Y-shaped cells, and allow that muscle to contract. So what gets a little wonky here is the phrasing here. And so what is a little confusing about this, it says cardiac action potentials. Okay, so right, I'm going to break it down for you. So we're talking about the electrical impulses that go across the heart that perpetuate this signal. So there's a part, we're just going to think of the heart muscle as resting. There is a part of this action potential series of events, which is called depolarization, which means contracting. This means resetting, repolarization, hyperpolarization, we're not going to talk a whole bunch about. And then refractory period is once again going to be a resting period. Okay. So we're going to look at ECGs or EKGs, and we're going to see what each little part of the EKG represents. Okay, and we're going to use these terms. So remember what they mean. It is automatic, it is rhythmic. If the heart doesn't beat automatically, we're in trouble. If it's not rhythmic, we're in trouble. Both of them are important things to keep in mind when a heart is beating. When we look at EKGs, not only are we looking for rhythmicity and the proper amount of beats per minute, but we're also making sure that each one of these wave presentations is approximately the same. Of course, there's going to be some differences, but for the most part, they should be pretty similar. Okay, so P wave is when the atria contract. QRS complex is when ventricles contract. T wave is when ventricles reset. We need to reset the atria, don't we? That's hiding right in this QRS complex. Okay. So once again, P wave, atria contract. QRS complex, ventricles contract. Atria reset. T wave, ventricles reset. So what resetting means is getting the proper amount of electrons on the right side of the cells. And we spoke about that briefly in previous lectures, but know that the heart muscle is getting ready to contract again. That's the basic gist of ECGs or EKGs, okay? Atria contracting, ventricles contracting, and then resetting. So if we go back to these phrases, atrial depolarization is when the atria contract. Atrial repolarization is when they reset. Ventricular depolarization is when they contract. Repolarization of the ventricles is when they reset. Hyperpolarization is when it goes below the median. I don't think we really need to get into that. And then there's a resting refractory period where they both have to reset themselves before they can contract again. And so that's the basic gist. If you see something wrong with a P wave, if it's missing, you may have something wrong with the atria. If you have, and this is very generalized, EKGs and ECGs are way, way, way more complicated than this. I'm giving you the basic gist. You know, misshapen T wave, or if there's an elevation between the S and the T, there could be ventricular issues. And you could see the little breakdown of intervals as well. Okay. Well, that's giving you the time breakdown. All right, so you can look at that as well, but I wanted to give you the general gist of what that means. So autonomic nervous system, if you don't remember it, please review it. Autonomic is automatic. That is that part of our nervous system that sort of just goes off and does its own thing and digests and has the heartbeat and has the regulation of blood pressure and so sorry, excuse me. So in this case with the heart, we can have an increase in the strength. Excuse me for just a second. My apologies, a little cough there. It is interview season. So with cardiac innervation, that means the nerve's going to it. It's going to be autonomic. It's driven by two realms of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic is fight or flight. That will increase heart rate and increase blood pressure. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. That will slow the heart down. Now, is that to say that we don't have some conscious control? Of course not. We do have some conscious control over it. We get really nervous. Heart rate goes up. We breathe deeply. We can slow it down. However, in general, it's under control of that autonomic nervous system. Myocardial cells, we already went over that. We looked at the intercalated discs. We looked at the stripes across those. I'm actually going to show you a picture in just a minute. They're Y-shaped. They have the intercalated discs between them. Let me see if there's a picture of that. All right, there isn't. The intercalated discs, remember they're Y shape, or where the Y touches the next Y. It is mononucleate. That means it has one nucleus. Wow, that's a bad Y. Woohoo! You get the idea. This is the intercalated disc. Now, there's teeny tiny fibers that are there. And let me rephrase that. Lines. They're lines. They're not fibers. There are fibers that run the other way that create these lines. And there's only one nucleus. Okay? Very similar to skeletal muscle, except for the fact that they only have one nucleus. Skeletal muscles are multiple nuclei. They have sarcomeres, which are units of contractile fibers. We'll look at that in a minute. Intercalated discs are those discs in between the Y-shaped cells that allow ions to flow from one to the other. Actin and myosin are the tiny fibers in these Y-shaped cells that allow the myocardial cell to contract and shorten. They're highly metabolic. They're going to use a lot of oxygen. Okay, so sarcomere is that contractile unit of the cell. You have thick and thin fibers. You have actin and myosin. I'm going to show that to you in just a minute. Now, what happens with excitation contraction coupling, that simply means that a nerve sends a signal down to those muscle cells and fibers to contract, and it will actually couple together and it will shorten as a unit. And what I mean by that, if we move into let's start with this picture. Okay, so here is one of those cardiac muscle fibers, cells, okay? We pull the fibers out, and if you look at that a little bit closer, let me try to make this picture bigger. Don't forget, you could download these and make things bigger yourself. Okay, there we go. That's better. Okay, so sarcomere is this contractile unit that goes from I band to I band. Okay? And what it has is myosin filaments, which are always known as thick, actin, which is thin, thin and tin, sounds similar, thin. And what will happen is actin will slide across the myosin actually grabs onto it and moves it, and it shortens the whole cell. And so if that happens across all the cells, it'll shorten the heart itself and cause that contraction. And then when the contraction is done, it relaxes, those bonds release, and they come apart. So you can see here, God, my computer's so slow, I apologize. Okay, you can see this sliding. This little arm here will actually move the fibers and make them all shorten and move towards each other. And then it'll relax over time with the use of energy to allow it to stretch back out. And the one way I can tell you to remember this is people who undergo rigor mortis, this happens because the muscles have contracted, but there is no more energy to release them. You need energy to release these bonds and allow these fibers to stretch back out. Okay, that's a tough concept. Let me know if you have any questions about that. What is true with regard to cardiac and skeletal muscle fibers? Oh, I really jumped ahead on that one. I apologize. So D, cardiac, should say cardiac cells only have one nucleus. We really reference skeletal more as a muscle fiber because it's long and it has many nuclei. And we did explain that earlier. So always make sure you reread these answers because sometimes the answers that you need to know are in there as well. cardiac output is going to be heart rate, so beats per minute, times stroke volume. And stroke volume is the amount pumped out per pump. So that is approximately 5 liters a minute for a normal adult. Ejection fraction is stroke volume minus, actually divided by end diastolic volume. So that is how much you're pumping out and how much is left. I believe I pulled up a good picture for that. Here it is. Okay, so ejection fraction is measured by the percentage of the total amount of blood in your heart that is pumped out with each heartbeat. Normal is 50% or higher. Ooh, let me move this back over. Okay, so I thought this was a great visual if you remember. And so 50% would be able to be pumped out per pump. And you can see there's high, there's normal, there's low, and there's possible heart failure. I'm guessing this is probably something that's fairly familiar to you at this point. Here is a breakdown of that sarcomere and what's called a myofibril. Myofibril is a collection of these actin and myosin fibers that are shortened during the contraction of cardiac, and this also happens in skeletal muscle. And then once that contraction is done, energy is used to release them so they can relax back out. Factors affecting cardiac output. This is a tough one. So preload and afterload. Preload is basically the amount of stretch of the heart at the end of diastole. So things that come into play at this point are how flabby is that heart? How strong is that heart? Does that heart have resilience and rebound, or does it not? So the law of Laplace describes the stress on that ventricular wall, and then Frank Starling law is, and I'm going to read it to you, the stroke volume of the left ventricle increases as the left ventricular volume increases due to the myocyte stretch, causing a more forceful systolic contraction. This is not necessarily a good thing. This can happen with a flabby, stretched out heart that's not healthy as someone gets older. And if you remember the overlap of the fibers that we see here, what happens is they get more, I wanted to draw, not move. They get more and more stretched out. So rather than this being the resting length, the resting length might be this wide, it might be this wide. It gets wider. And that is bad because it gets harder for the actin and myosin to connect with each other and contract efficiently and effectively. So you can kind of get what I call a flabby heart. Okay, and that is the concept of preload. And once again, I think if you think of it as getting the right amount of blood in, getting the right amount of blood out as a helpful way to think of it. Afterload is a resistance that the heart has of pushing the blood out from the left ventricle. So if you think about this for a minute, afterload can be increased by peripheral vascular resistance, generally from high blood pressure, first of all. Second of all, if you get hardened blood vessels, if you get depositions of plaque into the blood vessels, therefore creating atherosclerosis, it's harder for the heart to push the blood out, and that's stressful on the heart as well. So contractility of those myocardial cells can affect cardiac output. We spoke about the stretching of them and how that can make them less efficient, and it would affect that stroke volume. Medical agents could be an issue. Oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, if somebody has an issue with those, the heart will respond appropriately. Heart rate, we can have an issue with vasomotor control centers, which is actually in the brainstem. Baroreceptors affect the heart rate as well. And cardiovascular vasomotor centers can just be regulating the regular heart rate as well. I don't want to make that sound as if that is an issue, but that is one of the areas that will help to control it. Baroreceptors are little areas of nerve receptors that are located in the arch of the aorta and also in the carotid blood vessels, which monitor the pressure continuously of blood going up to the brain and blood going out to the body. The brain is very susceptible to having issues if there's a lot of pressure going up to the brain. So we have receptors to make sure that pressure is appropriate. Okay, Bainbridge reflex is when the heart rate increases in response to a rise in atrial pressure. This usually happens when the body senses decreased cardiac output, and its response in an effect to increase that cardiac output, it'll increase atrial pressure as well as heart contraction or heart rate. Hormones and biochemicals can definitely affect the heart as well. And there are hormones that we will look at specifically from different areas that can affect the heart rate. For example, epinephrine would increase it and cause your heart to race a little bit faster. Here is a chart. If this helps you, you can check it out. Now, moving from the heart to the body, we have systemic circulation. Arteries go away from the heart. They are usually larger, such as the aorta, the carotids, axillary, brachials, and then what happens is they turn into smaller arterioles. They need to do that because those arterioles will fill or feed capillary beds, and capillary beds are only one cell thick, the periphery of them. If we were to look at a capillary, it would literally be one cell thick. It's only big enough for a red blood cell to, that is a red blood cell. I know, I'm just awful with drawing. It's only big enough a capillary for a red blood cell to pass through one at a time, and it's made that way so we can off gas, per se, oxygen coming off that red blood cell. Once done, blood will then go into the venules heading back towards the heart, and then to larger veins to go to the heart itself. So we have the lumen, which is the internal cavity of blood vessels. Now we have different layers. I'm going to show you those different layers in the next picture. Vasa vasorum are the name of the blood vessels that supply the blood vessels, teeny tiny blood vessels that actually go to the wall of blood vessels themselves. Endothelium is a layer of thin cells that lie in the inside of blood vessels as well as the inside of the heart. Now, remember we spoke about the transmission of substances out into the tissues. It will pass through this endothelium. And the endothelium is also where we can have cholesterol buildup and blood clots buildup as well. So we also have vasomotion, also known as vasomotor, which can be induced by the tunica media. That is where the smooth muscle is for the blood vessels. Here's the structures. Tunica just means layer. Here's the vasa vasorum. You can see those blood vessels going out to the blood vessel itself. Tunica intima is going to be the innermost layer, and lining that innermost layer is the endothelium. And you can see it's just one layer of cells. So each one of the round dots represents a nucleus inside of a cell. Tunica media, what to remember from this is where the smooth muscle is. So that allows vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Vasoconstriction is to constrict, vasodilation is to dilate. And tunica adventitia is the outermost layer, also known as externa. If you go back to the previous slide, I think they used externa. There are subtle differences. I think for our purposes, you can almost use them interchangeably. So just know both of them as the external layer of blood vessels. So arteries carry oxygenated blood away. They are elastic or muscular. They are known as arteries, arterioles, meta-arterioles, which feed into the capillaries. Venous go away from the heart. They carry deoxygenated blood towards the heart. It is not blue in a human. It is slightly less red, just so you know. However, on the pictures, they show it as blue, just so you know. And we know those as veins and venules. So with an artery, you have a thicker muscular layer. With a vein, you have more connective tissue, and it tends to be floppier and less round, more oblong or unusually shaped. It's usually oval or close to that, but the arteries tend to be more consistently round. You can see the different layers there: tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa, also known as adventitia. Pressure can affect blood flow, as you know, and resistance. So it depends on how much pressure is being put behind that fluid and how much resistance we have in the blood vessels. So that can happen with the diameter and length of blood vessels can contribute to that resistance. And that, I've never heard it called this before. This is what I call the garden hose law. I can't even say that. So think about it. You're out with your kids are being brats, you cover the garden hose partially and it increases the pressure. If you decrease the diameter, it'll increase the pressure and vice versa. That's all that law means. That also, if you think about it, is attributed to blood vessels. If you have somebody who has high blood pressure, all of their blood pressure or all of their blood vessels will be slightly constricted. And I'm talking about high blood pressure that is of unknown origin, not necessarily from atherosclerosis. For some reason, they have constant contraction in their blood vessels, which increases their systemic blood pressure. So velocity, all these affect blood flow, vascular compliance. I think we've talked about that. This is an interesting topic. Laminar versus turbulent flow. I have a great story about this. So we had a patient that I used, God, that sounds horrible, that I dissected, I didn't use for dissection, that was kind enough to donate his body for dissection. And while dissecting him, we found his aorta and followed it down. And if you remember your anatomy, the aorta splits and goes to both legs and the pelvis. And so along this whole way, he had laminar blood flow, just straight, no turns. When we got to the split in his pelvis, he had a massive blockage, probably a combination of atherosclerosis and blood clots. And that is an example of laminar versus turbulent blood flow. Laminar goes straight, doesn't cause any problems. As you get to that bifurcation or split down to the lower extremities, bam, it bounces back, it kind of starts to go awry. And what that does, very similar to excess blood in the heart, if we're not pumping blood out, we can clot here, And he not only got a buildup of clot, he got a buildup of atherosclerosis. Well, to finish that story, as we dissected out his subclavians, which are up near his arms, he had a bypass from his subclavian down his thoracic torso, and it was right bypassing that clot. It was, I mean, it was cool to see. And I'm so grateful that he was willing to donate his body. I will never forget that. That was pretty cool. But laminar or straight, turbulent blood flow causes the blood to kind of circle, is how I think of it, and you can increase the chances of blood clots and conditions. Arterial pressure will be higher overall, okay? Systolic and diastolic blood pressure, let me see if they go into... Venous pressure is going to be lower than arterial pressure because it is returning back to the heart. Now, that causes a little bit of problem with venous return because we don't have as much pressure. Therefore, in veins, we have valves to help prevent backflow, and also the intrathoracic pressure of our chest helps to sort of suck the blood back towards the heart. Mean arterial pressure, I'm sure you're all familiar. I'm just looking at the formula. I don't remember it off the top of my head. Okay, diastolic plus 1/3 systolic minus diastolic pressure, okay, is how you calculate it. And I think that's something that you are mostly familiar with. But you know what? I will grab this for you so you can review it. So I want to get going because it's almost been an hour of lecture. Okay, regulation of blood pressure, it's affected by cardiac output. If cardiac output decreases, blood pressure will increase. Total peripheral resistance. Once again, if those baroreceptors, which are little areas of nerve receptors in the aorta, oh, actually, it's in the next picture. Here we go. So you can see in the arch of the aorta, right here, we have baroreceptors, and then we also have baro and chemoreceptors in the carotid arteries. They're constantly monitoring both pressure and also the chemicals in the blood. So they are yet another way that our body helps to regulate blood pressure by constantly checking and maintaining and readjusting according to the amount of resistance that we had in the periphery. And we'll get into also renin-angiotensin system in the future. We have vasoconstrictors, vasodilators. We spoke about like histamine, for example, is a vasodilator. If you have a strong histamine reaction to an allergen, you can actually go into shock because the blood will leave that cardiovascular circuit. We don't have enough blood in the cardiovascular circuit for it to contract, and that's not a good thing because perfusion goes down. Okay, nitric oxide, endothelins, prostacyclin, I would say endorphins, or other things that affect our blood pressure. Okay, baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, we have, once again, carotid and aorta. To sense, we have receptors also in the brainstem, which you'll see is in the medulla on the left there, that can constantly monitor what's happening in the body. Regulation of coronary circulation. So don't forget, coronary circulation is the circulation going to the heart itself. Needs to have the proper perfusion as well. It's under autonomic regulation. Not quite sure why they put this here, but good things to know. Question number 3. So think about this for a minute. Read through the answers, see if you were correct or incorrect. Make sure you're reading every single word. For lymphatic system, we always end up tacking it onto the end of stuff and really not talking much about it. So the lymphatic system is a vascular system. It picks up excess fluid. It also helps with some immune responses. We have lymph nodes. We also have lymph veins. They have venules as well, which are the small veins, and they will drain into larger ducts. Now, don't forget, we also have lymph nodes where we have collections of T cells and immune cells to fight off infections. And we all know those because they can get enlarged if somebody has some sort of infection going on. Here is a picture, which to me, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I am looking to see. Yes. Okay. So what happens is you can see the breakdown. See where it's pink versus blue. And what that simply means is where the lymph nodes and the lymph vessels drain to. So the majority of the body, lower body, will drain up to this cisterna chyli. It's just a little kind of collecting area for lymph substances. And through this thoracic duct, and then it will go into this left subclavian. We also have drainage from the left side of the head, the left arm, into the left subclavian. The pink shows drainage into the right subclavian vein through the right lymphatic duct. That will then both drain into the superior vena cava, into the heart, and then the heart will pump it out to where it needs to be dealt with. Spleen helps with the processing of white blood cells, breaking down red as well as white blood cells. Bone marrow is important with lymphatic system because it creates white as well as red blood cells. Thymus gland is where T cells mature. Let me clear this out. So, I don't know if it will let me. Just this little area. I don't really have anything representing it. If I were to crack open your sternum and we look at the back of the sternum, the thymus gland looks like a fatty little deposit there. So they're, I think, trying to represent it with that yellowish, whitish picture, but that's how the thymus gland is represented in the body, or is visualized in the body. And I think right lymphatic duct, thoracic duct, the left subclavian. I think I hit most of those. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Don't forget the specific area of lymph nodes. If that's not familiar, I'd at least to go over the basics. Cervical, and there's much bigger breakdown, which you're going to have to know, I'm sure, preauricular, postauricular, etc. But there's cervical, there is inguinal is a good reminder, axillary, lymph nodes. So just start to review those lymph nodes. I'm sure you're going to need them in the future. And that, my friends, brings us, 1 hour exactly, to the end of Anatomy and Physiology of the Heart, Chapter 25. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.